The Constitution, Birth of a Nation. Philadelphia, summer of 1787. The windows are nailed shut. The curtains are drawn. Outside, the temperature climbs past 90 degrees, and inside a small brick building, 55 men sit sweating in wool coats, forbidden from speaking a single word of what happens in that room to anyone outside it. They have gathered, officially, to fix a broken trade agreement. What they actually do is far more dangerous. They quietly throw out the government of the United States and build an entirely new one in secret with no legal authority to do so. If they fail, there may be no United States at all. Just 13 quarreling nations, broke, armed, and surrounded by empires that would love nothing more than to pick up the pieces. This is the story of how a room full of frightened, ambitious, deeply flawed men tried to answer a question no one had ever answered before. How do you build a government strong enough to survive, but not strong enough to become a tyranny? They didn't fully succeed, but what they built has lasted longer than almost any written constitution in human history. And the compromises, the failures, and the arguments they buried in that room in 1787 are still shaping the world today.
A country falling apart. To understand why 55 men broke the law to write a new government, you have to understand just how badly the first one was failing. After the Revolution, the 13 states were bound together by a document called the Articles of Confederation. On paper, it was a union. In practice, it was barely a suggestion. There was no president, no national courts, no power to tax. Congress could ask the states for money to pay soldiers, pay debts, or fund an army, and the states could simply say no. Many did. Picture a country that had just won its independence through 8 brutal years of war, and now couldn't pay the very soldiers who had won it. In 1783, unpaid officers in Newburgh, New York, came dangerously close to marching on Congress itself. Only an emotional, last-minute appeal from George Washington, who reportedly put on his reading glasses in front of the men and said he had grown gray in their service, talked them down from a coup. That was how fragile the Union already was, just months after victory. Then came Shays' Rebellion. In 1786, in the hills of Massachusetts, a former Continental Army captain named Daniel Shays led a small army of furious, debt-ridden farmers. Many were war veterans losing their homes to lawsuits and tax collectors after fighting for a country that had never paid them properly. They shut down courthouses by force. They marched on a federal arsenal. And when Massachusetts asked the national government for help putting it down, Congress discovered something terrifying. It had no army to send, no money to raise one, no power to act at all. For men like George Washington, James Madison, and Alexander Hamilton, Shays' Rebellion wasn't just an uprising. It was proof that the entire American experiment might collapse from the inside, not from a king, but from its own weakness. So in May of 1787, delegates from the states were summoned to Philadelphia. Officially, their job was narrow: revise the article.
The room where it happened, 55 delegates arrived in Philadelphia that summer, representing 12 of the 13 states. Rhode Island refused to send anyone at all, fearing a stronger central government would crush the power of small states. The men in that room were not ordinary citizens. They were lawyers, plantation owners, merchants, and veterans. A gathering later generations would call demigods, though most were painfully human, ambitious, anxious, and often disagreeing violently with one another. George Washington was voted president of the convention almost the moment it began, not because he wanted the spotlight, but because his mere presence gave the entire illegal gathering a kind of moral legitimacy. If Washington was involved, people reasoned, this couldn't be some reckless power grab. Benjamin Franklin, over 80 years old and in failing health, had to be carried to sessions in a sedan chair. He rarely gave long speeches, but when he spoke, the room listened. And then there was James Madison, small, sickly, terrified of public speaking, and about to become the single most important architect in the room. Madison arrived early, having spent months studying the failures of governments throughout history. He came with an entire plan already drafted. The first rule the delegates agreed on was secrecy. No leaks, no newspapers, no letters describing what was said inside. Guards were posted at the doors, windows stayed shut through a brutal Philadelphia summer, rather than risk anyone outside overhearing a single sentence. They wanted the freedom to argue, reverse course, and completely change their minds, without a furious public watching every twist along the way. What they were about to argue over would nearly tear the convention apart before it produced anything at all. The fight over power. The first major explosion came almost immediately, and it came down to one brutal question: which states get the power? Madison's opening proposal, known as the Virginia Plan, called for a strong national government with representation in Congress based on population, bigger states, more votes. To Virginia, Pennsylvania, and other large states, this seemed only fair. Why should Rhode Island's tiny population carry the same weight in government as Virginia's? But to the smaller states, it sounded like a death sentence. Under a population-based system, the large states could simply outvote everyone else on every issue, every time. William Patterson of New Jersey fired back with a rival proposal, the New Jersey Plan, which kept something closer to the old system. One state, one vote, regardless of size. For weeks, the convention teetered on total collapse. Delegates threatened to walk out. Some genuinely believed the entire project was about to die in that stifling room. The solution came to be known as the Great Compromise, engineered largely by Connecticut's delegates. Congress would be split into two chambers. In the House of Representatives, seats would be based on population. A win for the big states? In the Senate, every state would get exactly 2 seats, regardless of size. A win for the small states. It was messy. It was a compromise nobody loved completely. And it may be the single reason the convention didn't fall apart in its first month. But an even darker compromise was still ahead, one the delegates would spend far less time being proud of. The question they refused to answer. Here is where the story of the Constitution turns from inspiring to deeply uncomfortable, and it deserves to be told honestly. When it came time to decide how congressional representation would be calculated, another question exploded onto the floor. Should enslaved people count toward a state's population? Southern delegates, whose economies depended on slavery, wanted enslaved people counted for the purpose of representation, which would hand the South significantly more seats in Congress and more power in choosing the president. But at the very same time, those same delegates did not want enslaved people counted for taxation, since more population meant a heavier tax burden. Northern delegates saw the hypocrisy immediately. If enslaved people were, in the South's own laws, property, not citizens, not voters, why should they count toward political power at all? The result was one of the most consequential and morally troubling deals in American history, the 3/5 compromise. Each enslaved person would count as 3/5 of a person for both representation and taxation. This single formula didn't just settle an argument in a hot room in Philadelphia. It artificially inflated the political power of slaveholding states for decades, shaping presidential elections and congressional control well into the 19th century. The delegates also agreed to protect the slave trade itself from being banned by Congress for at least 20 years, and wrote a fugitive slave clause into the document, requiring escaped enslaved people to be returned to their enslavers even if they reached a free state. The word slavery does not appear anywhere in the original Constitution. The delegates were careful, almost surgical, in avoiding the word itself, using phrases like other persons instead. But the absence of the word did nothing to soften the reality being written into the nation's founding law. Some delegates, like Governor Morris of Pennsylvania, spoke out forcefully against slavery on the floor, calling it a curse that would corrupt the entire nation. But in the end, the desire for unity, for a document all 13 states could accept, won out over the desire for justice. It was a compromise that held the Union together in the short term and helped drag it towards civil war 74 years later. This is the part of the founding story that's easy to leave out of a triumphant narrative, but it belongs in it Because the Constitution's greatest strength and its deepest wound were written in the very same summer by the very same men building the machine. Beyond the fight over representation, the delegates faced an even bigger design problem. How do you create a powerful central government without recreating the tyranny they had just fought a revolution to escape? Their answer was a structure built almost entirely around suspicion. Suspicion of power itself, and of anyone who might hold too much of it. They split the government into three branches: a legislative branch to write the laws, an executive branch to enforce them, a judicial branch to interpret them. Each branch was given tools to check the others. The president could veto Congress. Congress could override that veto. Courts could rule on the laws Congress passed. And the president appointed the judges who needed Senate approval. It was a system built less on trust and more on the assumption that ambition would have to be used to counteract ambition, that the safest government wasn't one run by good men, but one where no single group could seize total control, even if they tried. The presidency itself was one of the hardest pieces to design. Some delegates feared a single executive was just a king by another name. Others worried a committee of executives would be too weak and divided to act decisively in a crisis. Eventually, they landed on a single president, but hedged that power everywhere they could. A fixed term, the threat of impeachment, and a strange indirect system for choosing him. That system was the Electoral College, itself a compromise. Some delegates wanted Congress to choose the president. Others wanted a direct popular vote. Many worried that ordinary citizens, scattered across 13 states with no national newspapers or communication, wouldn't have enough information to choose wisely among candidates from other states. The Electoral College split the difference. The public would vote, but their votes would be filtered through electors chosen by each state. It was never meant to be elegant. It was meant to be something every faction in the room could just barely live with. The fight to ratify. By September of 1787, after nearly 4 months of secret, sweltering debate, the delegates finally had a finished document. 39 of them signed it. Franklin, so weak he could barely stand, is said to have wept as he signed. But writing the Constitution was only half the battle. Now it had to be ratified, approved by at least 9 of the 13 states, and there was absolutely no guarantee that would happen. The country split almost instantly into two camps. The Federalists supported the new, stronger central government. The Anti-Federalists were horrified by it, warning that this new system could crush individual liberty exactly the way the British monarchy had. Patrick Henry, the same man who had once thundered, "Give me liberty or give me death," became one of the Constitution's fiercest opponents, warning it smelled suspiciously like a monarchy in disguise. To win the argument, Alexander Hamilton, James Madison, and John Jay wrote a series of anonymous newspaper essays defending the Constitution, piece by piece, clause by clause. 85 essays in total, published under the shared pen name Publius. Today we know them as the Federalist Papers, and they remain one of the most important explanations of American government ever written. But the Anti-Federalists forced a critical concession. Many states agreed to ratify only on the condition that a Bill of Rights, explicit protections for free speech, religion, the press, and due process, would be added immediately afterward. That promise sealed the deal. State by state, the Constitution was ratified. By 1788, it had the 9 states it needed to take effect. In 1791, true to that promise, the first 10 amendments, the Bill of Rights, were added, protecting the very freedoms the Anti-Federalists had feared would be lost.
A document designed to change. Perhaps the most radical idea buried inside the Constitution wasn't any single clause. It was the built-in admission that the document itself might be wrong or incomplete and would need to change. Article 5 laid out a path for amendments, difficult, deliberately hard to trigger, but possible. The framers didn't claim to have built something perfect. They built something that could be corrected. That single design choice is why the 3/5 compromise could eventually be erased by the 13th Amendment. Why the promise of equality, so blatantly denied to enslaved people and women in 1787, could later be extended through the 14th, the 15th, and the 19th Amendments. The Constitution didn't get everything right on day one, but it left a door open for future generations to walk through and fix it. That door has been used 27 times in American history. Each amendment is its own argument, fought by a new generation about what the country still needed to become.
The men who wrote the Constitution in that sealed, sweltering room in Philadelphia were not saints. They were political survivors, making brutal trade-offs to hold together a fragile, broke, and deeply divided country. Some of those trade-offs, especially around slavery, left wounds that took generations and a civil war to even begin to heal. And yet, what they built still stands, adapted and reinterpreted, argued over in courtrooms and living rooms more than 2 centuries later. Not because it was perfect, but because they built in the ability to keep arguing, keep amending, keep striving toward the more perfect union they wrote about in the very first line, without ever claiming to have already arrived there. The Constitution wasn't the end of the American story. It was the framework for every argument that would come after it. If you want to understand America today, its divisions, its debates, even its dysfunctions, you have to start here, in a hot, secret room in Philadelphia in the summer of 1787. If this deep dive into the birth of the Constitution helped you see the founding of America in a new light, make sure to subscribe for more cinematic history, and let me know in the comments which founding era story you want told next.